Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us here on this final day of MWC Shanghai 24. It's a real pleasure to be with you. My name is Tim Hatt. I work with the GSMA Intelligence group. We are the research and consulting arm of the GSMA. And in that capacity, it's a really cool job because you get to look across the mobile industry, the telecom sector, and the broader tech world. And within that context, the whole satellite and non-terrestrial networks movement has been such a focus area for the industry and for us, you know, following that and understanding that over the last sort of 3 to 4 years. We have actually run satellite summits in other parts of the world. And so we've seen the level of interest, but this is our first in Asia. So we're really excited to be here and to speak to the opportunities in this region. How it's going to work, we've got a 2-hour session. I'm going to start by giving some overview sort of remarks and bringing in some of our analysis and data from our recent reports on this area. We're then going to have a keynote speech from China Mobile. We'll then have a panel with speakers from across the sector, a second keynote from SES, and then a final panel. And that will take us through till 12 o'clock. I do want to make this as interactive as possible. I'm not naive. I know there's a language. I don't speak Mandarin, but we've got headsets in the audience, so please use those. And if you do have questions in the panel, we will try to get to those. If you don't get a chance to ask the questions you want to, hopefully the speakers will be available after the show, and of course we can be contacted. Right, so that's a little bit about us. As I said, we cover the whole sector, and this is a growing area within it. Now, I always show this slide first because it's important to understand why we're talking about what we're talking about. Why does satellite matter now in a telecoms context? Why should people really pay attention? Well, I think the first point to note is that there's a really pragmatic convergence happening. There's a coming together of land networks and space-based networks to tap into opportunities that previously haven't been addressed. We know that there is a coverage gap. We know that there is a B2B rationale to this. We know that there's a lot of emergency response applications that really do leverage NTN connectivity. All of that is in play. Whether you're talking about the telco operators or satellite groups, you know, tapping into new revenues is clearly a part of it as well. Growing the P&L. And then laying the foundation for long-term growth. I think when we look ahead, we're at a really exciting point in time because now that NTN standards have been put into the 3GPP standards, the addressable base for satellite connectivity has exploded. And that has a whole range of sort of opportunities looking ahead. If you watch these lines grow up, you sort of see an interesting trajectory here, which is that space is becoming a more crowded place. You look back in the sort of 10 or 15 years ago, whether you were talking about low Earth orbit or middle Earth orbit or geostationary, it was a pretty consistent pattern. Not much changed over that time. Things really started to change once Elon Musk and Starlink fired their first applications to the FCC in 2016. And we've seen this whole catalytic effect, this growth effect around the growth of low Earth orbit. And so now if you look ahead to the publicly announced launch plans, you get to a space capacity growth of like 4 or 5 times even what we see today. So that means more connectivity, it means faster connectivity, and it means more dependable coverage. So tapping into all of those things, we think opens up a range of new possibilities. I see a lot of you are taking pictures, which is fine. You'll see on the last slide, this data is coming from a recent report we published a couple weeks ago, and you can download it on our website, but please take the pictures if you want. So where do we stand now in terms of numbers, in terms of telco operators within this space? If you look on the table on the left, as of May, we track about 90 operators that have a partnership with a satellite company. And that actually has a coverage of, or an addressable subscriber base of around 60% of global market share. That means 60% of all people on Earth with a mobile phone now have tariffs with mobile operators that have partnerships with satellite companies. I hope that makes sense. But that means that that's the addressable base. So it's quite a significant number when you consider that's about 5 billion. The regional split outs, the greatest activity we see in Asia Pac. Unsurprisingly, all 3 of the Chinese operators, many others in parts of Asia. But this is a global phenomenon. It isn't just the US, it's not just China, it's not just Europe, it's global. And we think that's going to continue to grow. So that 2/3 of global market share now, I think that's probably going to be 80% plus within a year. So this is a map view of that. This is just a sort of easy to view graph. And you can see that how the split outs break out. Most of the operators that have satellite partnerships are still in the plan and testing phase. They haven't gone live with it. But we are expecting to see that through later in the second half of this year and into 2025. So we're moving from a period of testing and validation through to commercial deployments. So we should start to see constellations come online over the next 12 to 18 months, depending on where you are in the world. Now, a little bit on the competitive landscape. So, and there's more on this, but this is a very deep industry. There are a lot of satellite players involved. What we're showing here are the live and planned constellations ranked by their size. So the 2 biggest are Starlink and then China's effort through its satellite network group. I think the interesting thing here is that while Starlink has a clear first mover advantage in the Western world and parts of Asia, not China, but parts of Asia, it has created a huge amount of competition in the direct-to-device space. And that's one of the key areas we're going to discuss today, because that opens up new connectivity for people who either don't have a phone or who do have a phone but want better coverage than they currently have, ubiquitous coverage. So we're seeing a lot of activity and even consolidation among the satellite operators to be able to move into that space. And I think that's going to be a real key focus area for us as we look ahead. There are implications on the competitive front to that. There's implications on the spectrum front. There are still some chairs around the back. I see people are still filing in, but there should be some seats. So I showed a couple of slides ago what the picture looked like from the mobile operator landscape. This is the flip side of that coin, showing what the current partnership count looks like among some of the leading satellite companies. So if I use this pen, you can see here, these are ranked in terms of the number of live and planned constellations. It won't be an exhaustive list. There are many, many others in the sector that are not showing here. But there's sort of 2 points I want to make. One is that you have a large number of companies partnering with multiple mobile operators. This isn't, and we'll come to this idea of promiscuity, as in people working with more than one company. That's a very common phenomenon we're seeing now, and we're seeing it across, whether you're talking about AST, who's running direct-to-device using repurposed terrestrial spectrum, through to Starlink, through to SES and others. We're seeing that more and more. But the other thing is that over here, the share of the services that we're tracking, you can see a really high proportion of them now do offer direct-to-device or plan to offer that. If I had looked at these numbers 3 or 4 years ago, these would have been like almost nothing. This would have been close to 0. But now it's shot up to where among the leaders it's over half. So that should tell you, that's an important signal. That tells you that there is viable demand that companies see can be tapped into for providing connectivity directly to the handset. Particularly when you're talking about developing markets, being able to remove a satellite dish and all of the equipment required to receive the signal, it means it's cheaper, it means it's easier, and it ultimately means it's a quicker time to market. So there's a lot of momentum building there. All right. A few more slides. So I talked about the numbers in terms of the addressable base. This is showing the revenue side of it, or well, leading up to the revenue side by showing the coverage gap. So the coverage gap is one of the main drivers for how this whole movement between satellite networks and terrestrial networks began, and that's because if you break down the world, there are still about 500 million people who do not live within the range of a 3G or a 4G signal. The highest concentration of those as a proportion of population is Africa. But you do see this, again, being a global phenomenon. So this number here, these numbers, these percentages, is the number of people without coverage as a share of population. So you can see Africa, it's still over 10%. But even in Asia Pacific and even in Europe, you still have quite high numbers. And that's because it's very uneconomical, it's very expensive to provide coverage for the final 10%. And that is a huge driver and continued momentum as to why we see activity in this space. So, this almost reiterates what I said on the previous slide. Why does the direct-to-device movement accelerate all of the momentum that we've been talking about? Well, it makes it's easier, it's more affordable, it's quicker time to market, and the equipment part of the industry, the chipsets, the handsets, the signaling, that is now starting to become compatible with NTN standards. And I think we're going to see a sea change in terms of most of our handsets, whoever your provider is, supporting this connectivity. It's not going to happen overnight, but over a period of years, it is going to happen. It is easy, though, to forget that as much as we talk about satellite as servicing a consumer application and use case, there's a huge B2B dimension to this as well. So what we're talking about here are industries that have IoT connectivity that can be serviced by non-terrestrial networks. Whether that is in remote oil rigs, offshore wind, mining, agriculture. You see a lot of drones now being used to survey fields, whether it is for safety, public response to disasters. I could go on. There is a range of use cases there, and there's a lot of activity happening to prove the viability of this model there. when we add up the numbers, we think there is about 2 billion IoT devices addressable for satellite right now. That's probably a conservative estimate, though. That's probably on the low side. I think as we start to see the constellations become active, that number is going to grow up. We know from our surveys that a lot of businesses want satellite-enabled connectivity. They want that, and they don't currently have it because it's been too expensive in the past. So a lot of those barriers are being broken down. Now, from a revenue point, and I'll come to that in the next slide, we think this is sort of about $10 billion a year over the forecast horizon. We think that's what it's worth. So it's a significant number. I won't spend too much on this slide because it's sort of a point I made earlier, but this is just a different way of showing some of the major telco operators and the partnerships they have. You don't need to don't worry about the detail too much. The point I want to make is actually that the partnerships we're seeing, many operators are partnering with more than one satellite company. And the reason they're doing that is to be able to cover their entire footprint across different regions, as well as satellite operators providing different services. So right now, it's actually about, the average operator has 1.25 partnerships, and that's growing. Will we see change over time? Will there be consolidation in the satellite sector? Probably, because the market ultimately is going to have to, we're not convinced it can support the number of participants currently in place, but still you're probably going to see this ratio over 1 because the operators want to have a diversified set of partners. All right, I think there's 2 more slides here before we get to our first keynote speaker. I'll let you, I can see everybody's taking pictures, so I'll just let you do that for a minute. All right, so I've talked about the strategic rationale. We've talked about the addressable base for the consumer and the B2B side. What does that now add up to in terms of a revenue opportunity? We did some modeling, and this is sort of what we get to. If you look out, we did this a year or so ago, but if you look out to 2035, so just over 10 years from now, what do we think it could be worth? Well, we think it's about $30 billion a year. And consumer would take about 2/3 of that, B2B 30%, and the rest would be in the government and military sector. Now, I think the point to make, there are sort of 2 so what's from that. Why does that matter? One is that would be about a 2% uplift on the current total revenue base of telcos worldwide. So in an industry where people are looking for growth and looking to revive that, this is a good way of doing it. 2, it's a win-win situation because satellite companies stand to benefit by increasing their revenues, even through a partnership model. Most of the activity we see, the telco operators will continue to own the customer relationship, and the satellite will be providing the backhaul or fronthaul connectivity through a wholesale relationship. But that works for everybody because it grows the top line overall, and it starts to tap into the addressable base. So this is a significant amount. So last slide, before we get into our first keynote, where do we go? What does this mean? I think I won't go through all these questions, and this is sort of to set the table for the panels we're going to have. But I think there's interesting questions around technology innovation. There's questions around business model. There's questions around spectrum and regulation. That's what we're here to discuss, and I think we're going to look forwards to these points being raised, and as we go through the industry's development, as we follow those, these will be really interesting markers to watch. But suffice to say, we know that there's going to be a continued amount of high activity here as constellations are launched. So you've all been taking pictures. These are some of the reports that we have published recently on this. My team and I have followed the sector closely. We put out a lot of research. You can scan the QR codes and go to our website. The research is there. We're open for questions anytime. But I'll just let you finish taking some pictures, and then we will head into the first keynote. For those of you at the back, there's a lot of people standing. There should be some seats available. I don't know if the stewards can help guide them through. There's a lot of people standing. But please do try and find a seat. Anyways, I'm going to wrap up there. So thank you very much for that. And I am now going to hand over to our first speaker, Mr. Wei Deng from China Mobile.